Now let's talk about how we're going to fund this system. There are three questions, and we are not going to talk about formulas. But everything you need to know about school finance is in three questions. Now there are formulas that answer each of these questions, but I think if we stay focused on what the questions are, we can make sense of this. First question is, how many kids do we have? Does every kid count as one? Do we count them just for enrolling, or do we count them, do they have to actually show up and be in attendance? Do kids with special needs, like a bilingual kid or a special education kid, count a little more than one? Like maybe a 1.2 or something like that? We call those weights. That's the committee that Chairman Eisler was referring to that is continuing its work. So we have this series of formulas where every school district basically works through it. It's a template, and you answer the question, how many kids do I have? And by the way, yes, we do fund attendance. We don't get paid for kids who don't show up. And we do a very good job in our schools of getting kids to show up, but that's something we need to continue to work on. Dropouts and kids who are not present aren't getting the education they need. So that's question number one. Question number two, once we know how many kids we have, question number two is, how much money do we get per kid? And there's a whole series of formulas that looks at the different programs that a district might offer. And it might look, if you're a very small, sparse district out in rural Texas, or some other unique factor. But the second series of questions with a whole lot of formulas is how much money do we get a kid? In the state of Texas, that number is somewhere around $5,400, $5,500 per kid per year. Now that doesn't include the money that is spent on buildings, for debt, things of that nature. And there are a few formula amounts that are outside of that. But that's the primary amount that school districts get, somewhere around $5,400, maybe $5,500 per year, per child. But not every district gets the same amount. Why? Because state law says so. And this is probably the biggest weakness in our system right now. In summer of 2006, the last time we had a major session dealing with school finance, and we were in third special session in April and May of 2006, and we had a Supreme Court deadline of June 1st to adopt some changes or begin to close schools in Texas. And our legislature worked through that, spent many late nights, and adopted a system in spring of 2006, and we fund districts of what is called target revenue. Have you heard that term? Now the problem is everybody's target is different. Why? We don't know. It was an accident of history in summer of 2006. In Harris County alone, we have differences in target revenue between districts that are educating essentially the same population of over $1,600 a kid. $1,000 differences are fairly common around Texas. Now, I want you to think about that. In a class of 20,000 kids, a class of 20 kids, $1,000 a kid difference is $20,000 a classroom. Think that might make a difference? Sort of think it might. But we have these differences in target revenue, and this was meant to be temporary. In fairness, this was a kind of an emergency approach to school finance. I think the intention has been, ever since then, certainly the intention at the time in 2007 was to come back and begin to normalize the system, get back to a more rational number, and for budget reasons and a number of other constraints, we haven't done that. So we're now fairly locked into these target revenue numbers from summer of 2006 that are pretty wildly all over the place. Does everybody know who Jackson Pollock, the painter, is? The whole point of Jackson Pollock's paintings was to prove just there's randomness, there's no pattern. That's sort of what, if you look at all the school districts in the state on their target revenues, that's sort of what you get. It looks sort of like a Jackson Pollock painting. No real rhyme or reason to it, with big differences. And what's worse is they've been locked in since 2006. So I think that's probably, in my view, the single biggest flaw in our current system. But that's the second question, is how much money do you get per kid? And it varies from district to district. And there are a series of calculations to get to it, but that's the second big policy question. And then the third big policy question is how are we going to divide that between the state and the local communities? Because supporting education is a shared responsibility. In Texas, our Constitution, Article 7, Section 1, says that I don't think I did that. I hope I didn't have anything to do with that, sir. Article 7, Section 1 of our state constitution dates back to 1876, says that it shall be the duty of the legislature to establish and suitably provide for an efficient system of public free schools. Great language. There are a lot of other public services that we all use, that we all enjoy, that are important in our societies. But I think education is unique, that from the very beginning, it was a duty of the legislature. And why? Because in Article 7, Section 1, the preservation of the rights and liberties of the people is linked to an educated citizenry. A healthy democracy depends on an educated citizenry, even more than it depends on good highways. So this notion in America that there's a relationship between an educated citizenry and a viable, healthy democracy is pretty much, I think, part of our fabric. But we have this duty on the legislature. But the legislature may look to school districts, may authorize property taxes, subject to a vote of the people locally, which all districts have had. And so we have a shared responsibility. The state pays for part of the cost of public education, pays for it out of sales taxes or other general revenues, pays for some of it out of the available school fund, pays for some of it out of other sources of funds, and we pay at the local level out of property taxes. And I think in the around 2003, and by the way, historically from World War II until about 1997-98, this was about statewide a 50-50 share. Pretty stable over a long period of time, about a 50-50 share. Really beginning in the late 90s, mid-late 90s, the state share started dropping by about 1% a year. By 2003, the state share was down to the low 30s. And the local property tax was the larger piece. And the last reform we did at the state level got the state's number back up to a little over 50%, right at 50% in 2007. Guess what it is this year? It's down to about 42%. So this balance between how much we fund out of local districts and how much we fund out of state is a struggle. I think that's a part of our system that we're going to have to continue to work on, is getting that fair balance of how much we pay at the local level and how much we pay at the state level. So there are formulas that underlie all of these. I do think, again, I think the biggest flaw in the current system is that you have a wide disparity. It's that really middle column. And Mr. Chairman, you know, looking at the weights and things, I think those do need to be updated, and I think y'all have done some good work looking at that. We're always going to struggle, frankly, on the division between the state and local districts, but I'm very concerned when I see the state share, again, kind of falling as it's done over the last 4 years. But I think the real current structural problem is that middle question: how much money per district? And when you have wildly different answers depending on where you may be, and by the way, I was just looking, the districts in this area, the districts that are represented here today, I think the difference in your target revenue is several $100s per student. Now, some of you were taxing, and I think in fairness, Tomball, I think prior to compression had a higher tax rate, and so you've always, that's something your community elected to do, but even within districts that were at the same tax rate, there are differences in target revenue. And I think we're going to have to look at how to fix that. And I want to be clear, I think it needs to be fixed by improving the circumstances of districts that got stuck with low target revenues, not by pulling the top down. And our Supreme Court has commented on that, by the way. In the last case, the court said, you know, you could make a system that's actually equal for everybody, but it's equally lousy for everybody. And that's obviously not our objective. We want good schools in all communities and access to reasonable resources in all communities. So that's kind of what we're dealing with.